The train whistle blew loud and long as it pulled into Copper Ridge Station. Sarah Mitchell sat by the window, watching the small town come into view. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them together in her lap and took a deep breath. She was 24 years old and traveling alone. In her carpet bag, she carried everything she owned: 3 dresses, 2 pairs of shoes, her mother's Bible, and 17 letters from a man named Thomas Brennan, a man she had never met, a man who would become her husband today. Sarah touched the window glass with her fingertips. She could feel the vibrations of the train slowing down. She couldn't hear the whistle or the grinding of the brakes, but she could feel everything through her hands and feet. The world spoke to her in different ways now. She had been 7 years old when the scarlet fever took her hearing. One week she could hear her mother singing in the kitchen. The next week there was only silence. Forever silence. That was 17 years ago. She had learned to live in a quiet world. She had learned to read lips. She had learned to watch people's faces and hands. She had learned that most people spoke with their whole bodies, not just their voices. The train stopped. Sarah stood up and smoothed her blue traveling dress. It was her best dress, but it was old. The hem had been let down twice. She had sewn new buttons on the cuffs last week. She wanted to look proper for her new husband. She picked up her carpet bag and walked to the train door. The conductor was speaking to her. She watched his lips carefully. "This is your stop, miss. Copper Ridge. Do you need help with your bag?" Sarah shook her head and smiled. She stepped down from the train onto the wooden platform. The platform was crowded. Sarah had expected Thomas to be waiting, but she hadn't expected so many other people. There were at least 30 folks standing around. Women in their church dresses, men in clean shirts, children running between the adults. They were all staring at her. Sarah's stomach turned cold. This was not normal. Mail-order brides came to frontier towns all the time. Why were all these people here? She searched the faces for Thomas. He had sent her a photograph. A serious-looking man with dark hair and a thick mustache. Strong jaw, kind eyes. She had looked at that photograph every night before sleep. Then she saw him. He was standing at the back of the crowd. Tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a brown suit that looked uncomfortable on him. He was a rancher, not a town man. She could tell. His face was tanned from the sun. His hands were rough and scarred. He was nervous. She could see it in the way he held his hat. Sarah walked toward him. The crowd parted, but they didn't stop staring. She could see their mouths moving. They were talking about her. She was used to people talking about her. She had been deaf for 17 years. She knew that look. A woman in a fancy purple dress stepped forward. She was plump and pale, with her hair piled high on her head. Gold earrings dangled from her ears. She was smiling, but it wasn't a kind smile. Sarah knew the difference. She had seen many false smiles in her life. The woman's mouth moved fast. Sarah tried to read her lips, but the woman was speaking too quickly on purpose. That was another thing Sarah had learned. Some people spoke fast to confuse deaf people, to make them feel stupid. Sarah kept walking toward Thomas. She held her head high. Her mother had taught her that. "You walk with dignity," her mother had said. "You are not less than anyone else. You are different, but you are not less." Thomas stepped forward. He was holding something in his hands. A small slate board and a piece of chalk. Sarah's heart jumped. She had written to him about her deafness in her very first letter. She had been honest. She had told him she lost her hearing as a child. She had told him she could read lips and write notes. She had expected him to stop writing to her. Most men would have, but Thomas had kept writing. And in his last letter he had written something that made her cry. He had written, "I don't need a wife who can hear. I need a wife who can understand. I think you understand more than most people." Now he was holding up the slate board. He had written words on it in careful, neat handwriting. "Welcome to Copper Ridge, Sarah. I'm glad you came." Sarah smiled. A real smile. The first real smile since she left home. She set down her carpet bag and took the chalk from his hand. She wrote on the board, "Thank you, Thomas. I'm glad to be here." The crowd had gone quiet. Sarah couldn't hear the silence, but she could feel it. She could see it in their faces. They were watching this strange conversation. 2 people writing words instead of speaking them. The woman in purple stepped closer. Her mouth moved again, and this time Sarah could read some of the words. "Can't even talk. Poor man. What was he thinking?" Thomas's face changed. His jaw got tight. His eyes got hard. He turned to the woman and spoke. Sarah couldn't read his lips because his back was to her, but she saw the woman's face turn red. The woman stepped back. Thomas turned back to Sarah. He picked up her carpet bag with one hand. With his other hand, he gestured toward a wagon waiting near the platform. Sarah nodded and walked beside him. Behind them, the crowd began to break apart, but Sarah could see them still talking, still staring. The woman in purple was surrounded by other women now. Their mouths were moving fast. Their faces showed disgust and pity and satisfaction. They were enjoying this. They were enjoying her differentness. Sarah had seen this before. In her hometown, at church, at the market, some people felt better about themselves when they could pity someone else. Some people needed someone to look down on. Today, she was that person. At the wagon, Thomas helped her up onto the seat. He climbed up beside her and took the reins. Before they left, he wrote something else on the slate and showed it to her. "Don't listen to them. They don't matter." Sarah wrote back, "I can't listen to them anyway." Thomas read it and laughed. It was a real laugh. Sarah couldn't hear it, but she could see his shoulders shake. She could see his eyes crinkle at the corners. She could see his face transform from serious to joyful. She smiled too. Maybe this would be okay. Maybe this man was different from the others. The wagon started moving. Sarah watched the town pass by. It was small. One main street with shops on both sides. A church with a white steeple. A schoolhouse. A hotel, a bank. Everything a frontier town needed. She also saw the people. They stopped what they were doing to watch the wagon pass. They whispered behind their hands. They pointed. She saw a group of children laughing. She saw women shaking their heads. Sarah had left her home to escape this. She had hoped a new place would be different. But people were the same everywhere, she realized. Fear and ignorance traveled as far as hope and kindness. They rode out of town onto a dirt road. The land opened up around them. Rolling hills covered in brown grass. A few trees scattered here and there. Mountains in the distance, their peaks white with early snow. Sarah could feel the wagon moving beneath her. She could feel the wind on her face. She could see the sky stretching forever above them. Out here, away from the town, she felt like she could breathe. Thomas wrote on the slate again without stopping the wagon. He balanced the reins in one hand and wrote with the other. "The ranch is 5 miles from town. I have a daughter, Emma. She is 7 years old. She doesn't talk much. Her mother died 2 years ago." Sarah read the words carefully. A daughter. Thomas had mentioned her in his letters, but not much. Now Sarah understood why the girl didn't talk much. She had lost her mother. Sarah knew about loss. She knew about silence. She took the chalk and wrote, "I will be kind to her. I promise." Thomas read it and nodded. He looked at Sarah for a long moment. Then he smiled. A small smile, but genuine. They rode in silence for a while. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who didn't need words every moment. Sarah liked that. She had always felt that people talked too much. They filled the air with meaningless sounds. They were afraid of quiet, but Thomas wasn't afraid. He sat beside her, driving the wagon, and the silence between them felt natural. Felt right. The ranch appeared over a hill. It was bigger than Sarah expected. A large house made of wood and stone. A big barn. Several smaller buildings. Fences stretching across the land. She could see cattle in the distance. Horses in a corral near the barn. As they got closer, Sarah saw a small figure standing on the porch. A girl with long brown hair and a simple dress. She wasn't moving. Just standing there, watching the wagon approach. Emma, Thomas's daughter. Sarah's new stepdaughter. The wagon stopped in front of the house. Thomas jumped down and came around to help Sarah. His hands were strong and careful as he lifted her down. The girl on the porch hadn't moved. She was staring at Sarah with big, serious eyes, dark eyes like her father's. Sarah could see the sadness in them, the emptiness. This child was lost in her own silence even though she could hear. Sarah walked slowly toward the porch. She didn't want to frighten the girl. When she reached the steps, she stopped and smiled. She waved a small wave. Emma didn't wave back. She just stared. Sarah understood. This girl didn't want a new mother. This girl wanted her real mother back. Sarah couldn't give her that. Nobody could. But maybe, Sarah thought, maybe they could help each other. Two people living with different kinds of silence. Maybe they could find a way to speak to each other. Thomas came up behind Sarah with her carpet bag. He spoke to his daughter, but Sarah couldn't see his face to read his lips. Sarah woke up in a strange bed. Sunlight was coming through thin curtains. She sat up and looked around the small room. It was simple but clean. A bed, a dresser, a washstand with a bowl and pitcher. Her carpet bag sat in the corner where she had left it last night. Last night. The wedding. If you could call it that. The preacher had come to the ranch at sunset. Thomas had arranged it. Just the preacher, Thomas, Sarah, and Emma. The little girl had stood in the corner the whole time staring at the floor. The preacher had spoken words Sarah couldn't hear. She had nodded when Thomas nodded. She had signed her name in the book. And then it was done. She was Mrs. Thomas Brennan. Thomas had shown her to this room afterward. The guest room, not his room. He had written on the slate, "Take your time, no rush. We will figure things out slowly." Sarah had been grateful for that kindness. Some men would have expected different things on a wedding night. Thomas was different. She had known that from his letters, but seeing it in real life made her respect him even more. She got dressed in her work dress, a simple brown dress with no decoration. She tied her hair back in a bun and went to find the kitchen. The house was quiet. But everything was always quiet for Sarah. She walked through the hallway, touching the walls lightly to feel the vibrations of the house. She could tell if people were moving around by the way the floor shook slightly. Right now, nothing. The house felt empty. She found the kitchen. It was a mess. Dishes piled in the wash basin. Crumbs on the table. The stove was cold. The whole room felt sad and neglected. This was a house where a woman had died, where a man had been trying to raise a child alone, where nobody had the time or heart to make things proper. Sarah rolled up her sleeves. By noon, the kitchen was clean. The dishes were washed and put away. The table was scrubbed. The floor was swept. She had found flour and sugar and lard in the pantry. She had found eggs in the hen house. She had started bread dough rising in a bowl. She was peeling potatoes when she felt the vibrations. Someone walking. Heavy footsteps. Thomas, he appeared in the kitchen doorway and stopped. His eyes went wide. He looked around the room like he didn't recognize it. Then he looked at Sarah. He pulled the slate from his pocket. He carried it with him everywhere now. "You didn't have to do all this." Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and took the chalk. "I wanted to. I like to keep busy," Thomas smiled. He looked relieved. He wrote again. "I need to teach you more. About the ranch. About what we do. Can you come outside?" Sarah nodded. She followed him out of the house. The ranch was bigger than she had realized. Thomas showed her everything. The barn with 6 horses, the chicken coop with 20 hens, the smokehouse, the root cellar, the workshop. He showed her the cattle in the far pastures. He introduced her to the ranch hands. There were 4 men who worked for Thomas. Jake was the oldest. He had gray hair and a limp. He looked at Sarah with suspicion at first, but he nodded politely. Ben and Charlie were brothers. Young men, maybe 20 years old. They stared at Sarah and whispered to each other. The 4th man was called Red because of his hair. He didn't look at Sarah at all, just looked at the ground. Thomas wrote on his slate to tell the men about Sarah, that she was his wife now, that she couldn't hear but she could read and write, that they should treat her with respect. The men nodded, but Sarah could see they didn't understand. They didn't know how to act around her. She was used to this. She smiled at them and waved. They looked uncomfortable. Over the next few days, Sarah learned the rhythm of the ranch. Thomas and the men left early every morning to work with the cattle. Emma went to school in town. Sarah was alone during the days. She used the time well. She finished cleaning the house. She washed all the curtains and linens. She organized the pantry. She baked bread every other day. She made pies from the apples stored in the cellar. She cooked proper meals for dinner. Thomas always looked surprised when he came home to find hot food waiting. Good food. Sarah had learned to cook from her mother, who had run a bakery. Sarah knew how to make bread that was soft inside and crispy outside. She knew how to make pie crust that melted in your mouth. She knew how to make stew that was rich and filling. The men noticed too. Jake started smiling at her. Ben and Charlie started nodding hello. Only Red still ignored her. But Emma was different. The little girl came home from school every day and went straight to her room. She didn't eat much dinner. She didn't talk to her father. She definitely didn't talk to Sarah. Sarah understood. The girl was hurting. The girl didn't want a new mother. Sarah didn't try to force anything. She just made sure there was always food, always clean clothes, always a lamp burning if Emma came out of her room at night. 2 weeks after Sarah arrived, something changed. It was late afternoon. Sarah was in the kitchen making cookies. She loved baking. It was one thing she could do perfectly without hearing. Baking was about measurements and timing and feel. She didn't need to hear a timer. She could smell when things were done. She could see the color change. She felt the vibrations. Small footsteps. Emma. Sarah didn't turn around. She kept working with the cookie dough. She could see Emma's shadow in the corner of her eye. The girl was standing in the doorway watching. Sarah pretended not to notice. She shaped the cookies and put them on the baking sheet. She opened the oven and slid them inside. Then she started cleaning up, wiping flour from the counter. She felt more vibrations. Emma was coming closer. Sarah still didn't turn around. Then she felt a light touch on her arm. She turned. Emma was standing right next to her. The girl's face was serious and sad. She pointed at the oven. Then she pointed at her mouth. Sarah understood. The girl wanted a cookie. Sarah smiled and nodded. She held up 5 fingers. 5 more minutes. Emma would have to wait. Emma didn't leave. She stood there watching. Sarah pulled out a chair at the table and patted it. Emma climbed up and sat down. Sarah got the slate that Thomas had left in the kitchen. She wrote on it and showed Emma. "Do you like cookies?" Emma read it. She nodded. She reached for the chalk. Sarah gave it to her. Emma wrote in messy child letters, "Yes, my mama made cookies." Sarah's heart hurt reading those words. She wrote back carefully, "I bet your mama made very good cookies. These are my mama's recipe. She taught me when I was your age." Emma read it. She looked at Sarah for a long time. Then she wrote again, "Can you teach me?" Sarah felt tears in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She wrote back, "Yes, I can teach you everything my mama taught me." Emma almost smiled. Almost. Then the timer on the oven would have rung, but Sarah couldn't hear it. She could smell the cookies, though. They were done. She could always tell. She opened the oven and pulled out the tray. Perfect golden brown cookies. She put them on the cooling rack. Emma's eyes got big. Sarah waited 1 minute, then put 2 cookies on a small plate. She gave them to Emma with a glass of milk. Emma bit into a cookie. Her eyes got even bigger. She nodded while she chewed. Sarah sat down across from her and ate a cookie too. They sat together in silence. But it was a comfortable silence now. A shared silence. When Thomas came home that evening, he found them in the kitchen. Emma was helping Sarah set the table for dinner. The girl was actually helping, actually participating. Thomas stopped in the doorway and stared. Sarah saw his face. She saw the hope in his eyes. The relief. He had been worried about Emma, worried about Sarah, worried about whether this would work. Dinner that night was different. Emma ate everything on her plate. She didn't run to her room afterward. She stayed at the table while Thomas and Sarah wrote notes to each other on the slate. Thomas told Sarah about his day, about a fence that needed fixing, about a cow that was about to give birth, about Ben's horse going lame. Sarah told him about her day, about finishing the mending, about making preserves from the berries in the cellar, about Emma helping with cookies. Emma watched them writing back and forth. She looked curious. She picked up the chalk and wrote something. She showed it to her father. "Can I learn to write like you and Sarah?" "Fast writing?" Thomas looked confused. He showed the slate to Sarah. Sarah understood immediately. Emma wanted to learn sign language. The girl had been watching Sarah sign to herself sometimes. Sarah signed when she was thinking or working. It was natural for her. Emma had noticed. Sarah took the slate and wrote, "I can teach you sign language. It's like writing with your hands instead of with chalk. Would you like that?" Emma nodded hard. Yes, she wanted that. So that night after dinner, Sarah taught Emma and Thomas their first signs. "Hello." "Thank you, please, yes, no, more, all done." Emma learned fast. Her little hands copied Sarah's movements. Thomas was slower and clumsy, but he tried hard. They practiced until Emma was yawning. Thomas carried Emma to bed that night. When he came back to the kitchen, he and Sarah sat at the table. He wrote on the slate, "Thank you. I haven't seen her like this since her mother died." "You're good for her," Sarah wrote back. "She's a good girl. She just needs time." "We both do," Thomas nodded. He looked at Sarah for a long moment. Then he wrote something else. "I'm glad you came. I wasn't sure this would work. But I think it will. I think we'll be okay." Sarah smiled. She thought so too. The next few weeks passed quickly. Sarah fell into the rhythm of ranch life. She woke early and made breakfast. She packed lunches for Thomas and the men. She baked and cleaned and mended. Winter came early that year. By late October, the first snow had fallen. By November, the cold had settled in deep and mean. The cattle had to be moved to winter pasture in the low valleys where there was more shelter from the wind. It was hard work. Thomas and all 4 ranch hands were gone from sunrise to sunset, sometimes longer. They had to move hundreds of cattle across rough land. Sarah worried every day. She watched the sky and saw the clouds building. She felt the temperature dropping. She knew a big storm was coming. On the morning of November 15th, Thomas got up before dawn. Sarah was already in the kitchen making coffee and packing food. She had made extra biscuits and wrapped them in cloth. She had hard-boiled a dozen eggs. She had filled 2 canteens with water. Thomas came into the kitchen looking tired. He hadn't been sleeping well. The work was hard and there was so much to do before the deep winter came. He sat down at the table and Sarah put food in front of him. Hot oatmeal with honey, fresh bread with butter, strong coffee. He ate quickly. Then he pulled out the slate and wrote, "We're moving the last of the cattle today. Should be back by sunset, maybe a little after. Don't worry if we're late." Sarah looked at the words. She looked at Thomas. She wanted to write, "Don't go today. A storm is coming." But she didn't. Men had to do their work. The cattle had to be moved. She couldn't ask him to stay just because she had a feeling. She wrote instead, "Be safe. I'll keep dinner warm." Thomas kissed her forehead. That was new. He had started doing that in the past few weeks. Small touches, small signs of affection. Sarah liked it. It made her feel like they were becoming a real family. He left. Sarah stood at the window and watched the 5 men ride away on their horses. The sky behind them was gray and heavy. The wind was picking up. She could see the trees bending. Emma came down for breakfast. Sarah made her eggs and toast. The girl ate while practicing her signs. She was so good now. They could have whole conversations without writing anything down. Emma signed, "Is Papa coming home tonight?" Sarah signed back. "Yes," he said by sunset. Emma looked worried. She signed, "There's a storm coming." "Teacher said so yesterday." Sarah nodded. She was worried too, but she didn't want to scare Emma. She signed, "Papa knows about storms. He'll be careful." Emma went to school. Sarah started her daily work. But she couldn't stop thinking about Thomas and the men. She kept going to the window and looking at the sky. The clouds were getting darker. The wind was getting stronger. By noon, the first snowflakes started falling. Just a few at first. Then more, then more. By 2 o'clock, it was snowing hard. Sarah could barely see the barn from the house. She brought all the chickens inside their coop. She made sure the horses in the near corral had extra hay. She brought in extra firewood and stacked it by the stove. She was preparing for a long storm. Emma came home from school at 3 o'clock. She was covered in snow. Her face was red from cold. Sarah helped her out of her wet coat and boots. She wrapped a blanket around the girl and gave her hot cocoa. Emma signed, "School let out early because of the storm. Where's Papa?" Sarah signed, "Still working. He'll be home soon." But she was lying. She had a bad feeling. The storm was getting worse. She went to the window again. She couldn't see anything but white. The snow was coming down so thick and fast that it looked like a solid wall. Sunset was at 5:30. Sarah knew this because she had watched the sun every day since coming to the ranch. She needed to know time without hearing clocks. She had learned to read the sun in shadows. At 5:30, the sky just got darker. There was no sunset, just gray turning to black, and Thomas wasn't home. Sarah tried to stay calm for Emma. She made dinner. She set the table. She kept looking at the door. She felt the vibrations in the floor, hoping to feel the heavy footsteps of men coming home. But there was nothing. 6 o'clock. 7 o'clock. 8 o'clock. Emma was crying now. "Where's Papa? Why isn't he home?" Sarah held her. She didn't know what to sign. She didn't know what to say. She was scared. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones. At 9 o'clock, someone knocked on the door. Sarah felt the vibration. She ran to open it. It was Mrs. Patterson, the nearest neighbor. She lived on the ranch 2 miles south. She was covered in snow. Her husband was with her. They came inside quickly. Mrs. Patterson's mouth was moving fast. Sarah tried to read her lips, but the woman was talking too quickly. Sarah got the slate and gave it to her. Mrs. Patterson wrote, "The men aren't back. My husband went looking. He found their tracks but lost them in the storm. We need to organize a search party. Other ranchers are gathering in town. Can you come?" Sarah's heart was pounding. Thomas was lost in the storm. She knew it. She had known something was wrong. She wrote back, "Yes, I'm coming. But who will watch Emma?" Mrs. Patterson wrote, "Bring her to my house. My daughter will watch her." Sarah grabbed her coat and boots. She bundled Emma up. They went out into the storm with the Pattersons. The wind was so strong it almost knocked Sarah over. The snow was blinding. They made it to the Pattersons' wagon and climbed in. At the Patterson house, Emma didn't want to let go of Sarah. The little girl was terrified. Sarah signed to her, "I will find your papa, I promise. You stay here and be brave." Then Sarah and the Pattersons rode into town. The ride took an hour. It usually took 30 minutes. The storm was that bad. In town, several men were gathered at the general store. Sarah recognized some of them. Other ranchers. The sheriff. The doctor. They were all talking and pointing at a map. When Sarah walked in, they stopped talking. They stared at her. Mrs. Hastings was there too, with several other women. They were making coffee and sandwiches for the search party. Mrs. Hastings saw Sarah and her face twisted. She said something to the woman next to her. They both looked at Sarah with disgust. Sarah ignored them. She walked up to the men and took the slate from her pocket. She wrote quickly and showed it to the sheriff. "I'm Thomas Brennan's wife. Where are they? Where was the last place they were seen?" The sheriff looked uncomfortable. He was a big man with a thick beard. He took the slate and wrote back, "Ma'am, we found some tracks heading toward the North Canyon, but we lost them. The storm is too bad. We can't search tonight. We'll have to wait until morning." Sarah felt panic rising in her chest. Morning, that was hours away. Thomas could freeze to death in hours. The men could die waiting for morning. She wrote fast, her hand shaking. "No, we search now. They won't survive until morning in this cold." The sheriff shook his head. He wrote, "It's too dangerous. We can't see anything. We'll get lost too." "I'm sorry, ma'am. We have to wait." The other men nodded. They agreed. It was too dangerous to search in a blizzard. They could die too. Sarah looked around the room. All these men. All this help. And they were just going to wait. Going to let Thomas and the ranch hands freeze while they drank coffee in a warm store. She took the slate and wrote again. "I'm going. Who will come with me?" The men looked at each other. No one moved. No one volunteered. Mrs. Hastings laughed. Sarah couldn't hear it, but she could see the woman's shoulders shaking. She could see the mean smile on her face. Mrs. Hastings said something to the other women and they all laughed too. Sarah's face burned with anger and shame. She turned back to the men and wrote again. "I know where they are. I know which way they went. I've been watching them every day. I know their patterns. I can find them." The sheriff shook his head. He wrote, "Ma'am, with all respect, you can't even hear. How are you going to find anyone in a blizzard?" Those words hit Sarah like a slap. She stepped back. She looked around the room at all the faces. Some pitying, some mocking, some just uncomfortable. No one believed in her. No one thought she could help. They thought she was useless, a burden, a deaf woman who couldn't possibly do anything important. Then she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned. It was old Jake, Thomas's ranch hand. He had ridden into town separately to get help. His face was serious and determined. He took the slate from Sarah's hands. He wrote in shaky letters, "I'll go with her. She knows things. She sees things we don't see. If she says she can find them, I believe her." Sarah felt tears in her eyes. Someone believed in her. Finally, someone believed she wasn't useless. The sheriff tried to argue, but Jake was already putting on his coat. He was already gathering supplies, rope, lanterns, blankets. He moved with purpose. Sarah did the same. She found a pack and filled it. Extra socks, matches, a knife, food, water, everything they might need. Mr. Patterson stepped forward. He wrote on the slate, "I'm coming too. That's my neighbor out there." Then one of the other ranchers, a young man named Miller, stepped forward. "I'll come. Someone has to make sure you all don't get lost. 4 people. It would have to be enough." Mrs. Hastings said something loud. Sarah could see her mouth moving angrily. The sheriff looked embarrassed, but he didn't stop them. He just shook his head like they were all fools. They went outside into the storm. They had 4 horses and 2 lanterns. The wind immediately tried to blow out the lanterns. They had to shield them with their coats. Sarah climbed onto her horse. She had learned to ride in the past few months. She wasn't great at it, but she could manage. Jake rode up next to her and showed her the slate. Which way? Sarah closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about all the times she had watched Thomas leave. She had memorized which direction he went. The news of the rescue spread through Copper Ridge like wildfire. By morning, everyone in town knew the story. The deaf woman had led the search party. The deaf woman had found the lost men. The deaf woman had saved Thomas Brennan's life. Some people were amazed. Some people were grateful. But Mrs. Hastings and her friends were not happy. They didn't like being wrong. They didn't like that Sarah had proven herself. They especially didn't like that they had been cruel to someone who turned out to be a hero. So they decided it was luck. That's what Mrs. Hastings told everyone. Pure luck, she said. Anyone could have stumbled onto that cabin. The poor thing didn't know what she was doing. She was just lucky. Sarah heard about this from Mrs. Patterson, who wrote it all down on the slate. Sarah wasn't surprised. She had learned that some people would never change. Some people needed someone to look down on. If they admitted Sarah was capable and intelligent, then they would have to admit they had been wrong. They would have to face their own cruelty. Mrs. Hastings wouldn't do that. She was too proud. Thomas was home now, recovering. His leg was broken badly and would take months to heal. The doctor had said it and put it in a splint. Thomas had to stay in bed for at least 6 weeks. He couldn't work. He couldn't ride. He couldn't do any of the things a rancher needed to do. Sarah took over. She had been watching Thomas run the ranch for months. She knew what needed to be done. She knew when the cattle needed to be checked. She knew when supplies needed to be ordered. She knew which fences needed repairs and which tools needed replacing. She couldn't tell the men what to do with her voice, so she wrote notes. Every morning she would write out the day's tasks for Jake. He would read them to the other men. At first, the ranch hands thought it was strange taking orders from a woman, especially a deaf woman. But Jake told them firmly, "Mrs. Brennan knows what she's doing. You'll do what she says," and they did. Ben and Charlie checked the cattle. Red fixed the broken gate. Jake supervised everything and reported back to Sarah each evening. The ranch kept running. In some ways, it ran better than before. Sarah's careful observations had caught problems before they became serious. She also started baking to earn money. The ranch needed income while Thomas was laid up. Sarah made bread, pies, and cookies. She made so much that Emma had to help her pack everything into baskets. Sarah took the baked goods to town once a week. She set up a small table outside the general store. She put up a sign that said, "Fresh baked goods, Mrs. Brennan's recipes." People stopped to look. They remembered Sarah's rescue. Some of them felt guilty about how they had treated her. They bought her bread and pies. They told her the food was delicious. They started coming back every week for more. Sarah's baking business grew quickly. She couldn't make enough to keep up with demand. People from neighboring ranches started placing orders. The general store asked if they could sell her goods inside. Within a month, Sarah was making more money than she had ever imagined. But Mrs. Hastings was not happy about this either. She saw Sarah succeeding. She saw people praising Sarah's cooking. She saw Sarah becoming respected in the community. And she hated it. Mrs. Hastings started a whisper campaign. She told her friends to stop buying from Sarah. She said the food wasn't that good. She said people were only buying it out of pity. She said Sarah was taking advantage of people's kindness after the rescue. Some of Mrs. Hastings' friends listened. They stopped buying from Sarah. But most people didn't care what Mrs. Hastings said. They liked Sarah's food. They liked Sarah. They had seen her bravery and her skill. They weren't going to stop supporting her just because Mrs. Hastings said so. This made Mrs. Hastings even angrier. She decided to take more direct action. She went to the Women's Church Committee and proposed that Sarah should not be allowed to sell her goods outside the church on Sundays. "It's not proper," Mrs. Hastings said. "It's too commercial. The church is a holy place, not a marketplace." The committee agreed. They told Sarah she couldn't sell her baked goods after church anymore. Sarah just nodded and moved her table to the general store full-time. She didn't argue. She didn't fight. She just adapted. But Thomas was furious when he heard about it. He wanted to confront Mrs. Hastings. He wanted to tell her exactly what he thought of her. Sarah stopped him. She wrote on the slate, "Don't, it's not worth it. She wants a fight." "Don't give her one," Thomas argued. He wrote back, "She's been cruel to you since the day you arrived. She tried to turn the whole town against you. She doesn't deserve your kindness. Sarah wrote, I don't do it for her. I do it for me. I don't want to be like her. I don't want to be bitter and mean. I want to be better than that. Thomas looked at his wife with new eyes. She was stronger than he had realized. Not just physically strong, though she was that too, but strong in spirit, strong in character. She had faced cruelty with grace. She had faced doubt with quiet confidence. She had proven herself without needing to boast or demand recognition. He fell in love with her in that moment. Really in love. Not just gratitude or companionship, but deep, real love. He pulled her close and kissed her. Sarah was surprised, but she kissed him back. When they pulled apart, both of them were smiling. Thomas wrote on the slate, I love you. I should have said it sooner. Sarah took the chalk with shaking hands. She wrote back, I love you too. I have for a while. They sat together holding hands. Emma came in and saw them. She smiled. A real happy smile. She signed, finally. I've been waiting for you two to figure it out. Sarah and Thomas laughed, but Mrs. Hastings wasn't done. The annual harvest social was coming up. It was the biggest event in Copper Ridge. Every family in town attended. There was music and dancing and food. It was a celebration of the year's work and a chance for the community to come together. Mrs. Hastings was in charge of organizing it. She had been in charge for 10 years. She decided who could participate, who could bring food, who could help set up. She had complete control, and she decided that the Brennans were not invited. She didn't send them an invitation. When other families asked if the Brennans were coming, Mrs. Hastings said, Oh, I'm sure they're too busy. With Thomas's injury and all. I didn't want to burden them, but everyone knew the truth. Mrs. Hastings had deliberately excluded them. Some people thought it was wrong, but no one said anything. Mrs. Hastings was the wife of the bank owner. She was powerful in town. People didn't want to cross her. Sarah found out when Mrs. Patterson stopped by with vegetables from her garden. She wrote on the slate, Are you going to the harvest social next week? Sarah wrote back, I didn't know about it. Mrs. Patterson looked uncomfortable. She wrote, Mrs. Hastings is organizing it. I thought she would have told you. Sarah understood immediately. She wasn't invited. She and Thomas and Emma were being deliberately excluded from the community's most important event. It hurt. Sarah couldn't pretend it didn't. After everything she had done, after saving lives and helping the community, she was still being punished for being different. She was still being rejected. That evening, Thomas asked about the harvest social. Sarah told him they hadn't been invited. Thomas's face went red with anger. He tried to get out of bed, but his leg wouldn't let him. He was trapped, helpless to defend his wife and daughter. He wrote furiously on the slate, I'm going to that social. I don't care if I have to crawl there. We're going. Emma signed from the doorway. I don't want to go if they don't want us there. Thomas wrote, They don't get to decide if we're part of this community. We live here. We work here. We belong here. We're going. Sarah wasn't sure. She didn't want to make things worse. She didn't want to face Mrs. Hastings and her cruel friends. But she looked at Thomas's determined face. She looked at Emma's sad eyes. She realized that staying home would be letting Mrs. Hastings win. It would be teaching Emma that it was okay to be excluded, that it was okay to accept cruelty. She wrote on the slate, Okay, we'll go. The week before the harvest social, Sarah worked harder than ever. She made her best pies. Apple pies with cinnamon, cherry pies with lattice tops, pumpkin pies with whipped cream. She made 3 of each kind. If they weren't officially invited, she would show up with enough food that they couldn't be turned away. She also made a new dress. She had been saving fabric for months. Deep green fabric that made her eyes look brighter. She sewed it carefully, making sure every stitch was perfect. She wanted to look her best. She wanted to hold her head high. On the day of the social, Thomas insisted on going even though his leg was still healing. Sarah and Jake helped him into the wagon. They propped his leg up carefully. Emma sat between Sarah and Thomas wearing her Sunday dress. They drove into town. The social was being held in the town square. Tables were set up with food. Lanterns hung from posts. A small band was playing music that Sarah couldn't hear, but she could see people's feet tapping. When the Brennan wagon pulled up, people stopped talking. They stared. Mrs. Hastings, standing at the center of everything in her fancy purple dress, turned white when she saw them. Sarah climbed down from the wagon with her basket of pies. She walked straight to the food table. People stepped aside to let her through. She set down her pies carefully and arranged them nicely. Thomas climbed down more slowly, leaning on Jake. He limped toward the center of the gathering. People made a path for him. The morning after the harvest social, Sarah woke up feeling different, lighter, like a weight she had been carrying for months had finally been lifted from her shoulders. She got up and went to the kitchen to start breakfast. Emma was already there, setting the table. The girl had changed so much in the past few months. She smiled now. She laughed. She signed constantly, talking to Sarah about everything and nothing. She was a different child than the silent, sad girl Sarah had met on her first day. Thomas came into the kitchen, still limping but getting stronger every day. His leg was healing well. The doctor said he would be able to ride again by spring. Thomas sat down at the table and Sarah put food in front of him. Scrambled eggs, bacon, fresh bread with butter. While they ate, there was a knock at the door. Sarah felt the vibration and went to answer it. Mrs. Patterson was standing on the porch with another woman Sarah didn't know. Well, Mrs. Patterson was holding a basket. Covered with a cloth, she came inside and set the basket on the table. She pulled out the slate and wrote, "This is Mrs. Chen. Her son is 8 years old. He lost his hearing last year from an illness. She heard about how you teach Emma sign language. She wants to know if you can teach her son too." Sarah looked at Mrs. Chen. The woman's face was hopeful and desperate. Sarah knew that look. It was the look of a mother who wanted to help her child but didn't know how. Sarah took the slate and wrote, "Of course. Bring him any time. I'll teach him everything I know." Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears. She grabbed Sarah's hands and squeezed them tight. She was so grateful she couldn't speak. Sarah understood. She squeezed back. Over the next few weeks, more families came to the ranch. There were 3 other deaf children in the area. Nobody had known what to do with them. Nobody had known how to help them. But now they had Sarah. Sarah started teaching sign language 3 times a week. The children came to the ranch house and Sarah taught them in the kitchen. She taught them signs for common words. She taught them how to communicate with their families. She taught them that being deaf didn't mean being broken. The parents came too. They wanted to learn. They wanted to be able to talk to their children. Sarah taught them all. Soon signing was becoming common in Copper Ridge. People learned basic signs. Shopkeepers learned how to communicate with deaf customers. Teachers learned how to include deaf students. Sarah also kept baking. Her business was growing so fast that she couldn't keep up alone. She hired 2 women from town to help her. They would come to the ranch 3 days a week to bake. Sarah taught them her recipes. They worked together and the kitchen was always full of wonderful smells. The money from the baking business was good. Really good. Thomas was amazed at how much Sarah was earning. With that money, they were able to fix up the ranch. They repaired the barn. They bought new equipment. They hired 2 more ranch hands. The Brennan Ranch was becoming one of the most successful ranches in the area. People noticed. Other ranchers started asking Thomas for advice. How was his ranch doing so well? What was his secret? Thomas always gave the same answer. "My wife, Sarah, sees things I miss. She plans ahead. She's the smartest person I know." The men would look surprised. They weren't used to hearing a man praise his wife like that. But Thomas didn't care what they thought. It was the truth. Meanwhile, Mrs. Hastings had become quiet. She still lived in town, but she wasn't the social leader anymore. People had stopped listening to her. Her friends had drifted away. She had lost her power through her own cruelty, and everyone knew it. One day in early spring, Sarah was in town buying supplies. She came out of the general store and saw Mrs. Hastings standing on the sidewalk. The woman looked older than before, tired. Her fancy dresses looked wrinkled. Her hair wasn't styled as perfectly. Sarah could have walked past her, could have ignored her like Mrs. Hastings had ignored Sarah for so many months. But Sarah wasn't made that way. She stopped. Mrs. Hastings looked at her with sad, bitter eyes. Her mouth moved. Sarah couldn't quite read the words. Mrs. Hastings seemed to realize this. She gestured for the slate that Sarah always carried. Sarah handed it to her. Mrs. Hastings wrote slowly, like the words were hard to form. "I was wrong about you. I'm sorry." Sarah read the words. She looked at Mrs. Hastings for a long moment. The woman looked broken, defeated. Sarah could have said something cruel, could have thrown the apology back in her face, but what good would that do? She took the slate and wrote, "Thank you. I accept your apology." Mrs. Hastings looked shocked. She had expected anger, expected rejection. She didn't know how to respond to Grace. Sarah wrote again, "Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is what we do after." She handed the slate back and walked away. She didn't know if Mrs. Hastings would change. Some people never did, but Sarah had done her part. She had shown kindness when she could have shown hate. That was all she could do. Summer came and went. Thomas's leg healed completely. He was back to full work on the ranch, but things were different now.
He and Sarah worked as partners.
He handled the cattle and the land. She handled the finances and the planning. Together they were building something special. Emma was thriving. She was top of her class at school. She was teaching other children sign language. She had become a bridge between the deaf community and the hearing community. She was proud of her stepmother, and she made sure everyone knew it. One day in late summer, a letter arrived from the territorial government. It was addressed to Sarah. Thomas brought it to her looking curious. Sarah opened it and read carefully. Her eyes got wide. Her hands started shaking. Thomas grabbed the slate immediately. "What is it?" "What's wrong?" Sarah wrote, "Nothing's wrong. The Territorial Education Board heard about my work teaching deaf children. They want to fund a proper school. A school for deaf children in this region. They want me to run it." Thomas stared at the words. Then he looked at Sarah. Then he grabbed her and spun her around, careful of his still healing leg. Emma came running to see what the excitement was about. Sarah couldn't believe it. A real school. A place where deaf children could learn and grow and thrive. A place where they wouldn't be made to feel broken or useless. A place where they could be themselves. The school opened that fall in a building in town that used to be a warehouse. Sarah had 20 students the first year, children from all over the territory. Some lived at the school during the week. Some came from nearby farms. Sarah taught them everything: reading, writing, arithmetic, history. But more than that, she taught them confidence. She taught them that being deaf didn't limit what they could become. She taught them to be proud of who they were. Parents would come to visit, and they would cry seeing their children happy and learning. So many of them had been told their deaf children couldn't learn, couldn't do anything. Sarah proved them all wrong. The school grew every year. By the third year, Sarah had to hire 2 more teachers. By the 5th year, they had 40 students. The school became famous throughout the territory. People called it the Brennan School, even though Sarah tried to name it something else. Thomas was proud. So incredibly proud. He would tell anyone who listened about his remarkable wife, about how she had come to Copper Ridge as a mail-order bride and transformed the whole community, about how she had saved his life, about how she saw things no one else saw. One evening, 10 years after Sarah first arrived in Copper Ridge, there was a special celebration. The territorial governor was visiting to dedicate a new building for the school. The whole town turned out for the event. Sarah stood on the platform in her best dress. She was 34 years old now. Her hair had some gray in it. She had lines around her eyes from smiling. Next to her stood Thomas, still strong and handsome, his arm around her waist. On her other side was Emma, now 17 years old and training to be a teacher at the school. The governor gave a speech about education and opportunity. He praised Sarah's work. He talked about how she had changed lives. Sarah couldn't hear any of it, but Emma signed the whole speech for her. Then it was time for Thomas to speak. Sarah knew he had been working on a speech for weeks. He had written it down and shown it to her. It was beautiful. It was honest. It was full of love. Thomas stepped up to the podium. He looked out at the crowd, at the faces of people he had known for years, at his neighbors and friends, at the people who had laughed when his deaf bride arrived 10 years ago. He began to speak. Emma signed for Sarah, but Sarah was watching the crowd. She was watching their faces as Thomas told their story. The story of how they met, how the town had treated her, how Mrs. Hastings had been cruel, how Sarah had proven herself again and again. Then Thomas's voice got louder, more passionate. Emma's hands moved faster as she signed. When Sarah first arrived, you laughed. You pitied me. You thought I had settled for less because I was desperate. You thought she was broken, damaged, useless. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. They remembered. They were ashamed now, but they remembered. But you were wrong. You were all wrong. Sarah isn't broken. She's exceptional. She doesn't need her hearing to see the truth about people. She doesn't need her hearing to be brilliant and capable and strong. Thomas paused. He looked directly at the section where Mrs. Hastings sat. She was there with her husband, looking small and quiet. She had never regained her social power.